Hello everybody, my name is Roland. Welcome to my channel where I talk about political, historical and military topics. And today I want to talk about the repeated Russian threats of nuclear war since their invasion of Ukraine. So first of all, we need to talk about the fact that they have been talking about it and have made this threat basically since day one. So what does that mean for us? And Russians view nuclear weapons not in the same way as we do in our Western countries. Why is this significant? What does that mean for any kind of analysis that we do about these repeated threats? Finally, I want to talk about that things are not going well in the Donbas regions. The Russians are basically stuck, and again, these threats of nuclear war come up. Let's get started. First of all, talk and action is not the same. When Putin, Lavrov, or other people in the Russian government are talking about nuclear weapons, this is yet to mean anything beyond talking about it. They are talking about nuclear weapons all day long. We can't stop them talking about it. When it gets more serious is when they are talking about nuclear weapons within the military command structure. There is a chain of command, and that is particularly elaborate and structured when we are talking about warfare and especially nuclear warfare. So in essence, nuclear warfare is not a matter where one person or two or three people alone can decide to push a button. And we need to get this idea out of our head that Putin has the finger on the nuke button, so we can't do X. Looking at the whole situation, it is fact that NATO aircraft are patrolling the borders of the NATO alliance and are gathering all kinds of intelligence data. So it is not too far-fetched to assume that some, most, or all of this data is landing somewhere in Ukraine. So de facto, the Russian position a couple of days ago has been corrected today. A couple of days ago, the Russian position was apparently that Putin sees himself at war with the NATO alliance by their proxy Ukraine. Now, Lavrov today said otherwise, and following the old mantra of don't believe it until the Kremlin denies it, that is exactly the position that they are talking about. Putin sees himself at war with the West. So when he is now making the repeated threats and now saying, or now we are hearing that the generals are talking about that, then that is more serious than Putin is talking about nuclear weapons. He can do that all day long. The matter of fact is that in the situation that the Russians and the Ukrainians are in right now, Putin is talking about a tactical nuke strike on Ukrainian positions or talking about tactical nuke strikes on Western allies. And why would he strike Western allies? Because we are in one way or another involved in this war, as he sees it. Now, there is positions on either side of the argument whether sending weapons to Ukraine constitutes that fact that we are actually at a war with the Russians. And we do not have to literally shoot at the Russians. We just need to support somebody else shooting at the Russians to make us involved in this war. And that has been going on from day one. Putin had the finger on the nuke button from day one. Then my question is, why has he not pressed it yet? Because he won't. Nuclear weapons are strategic weapons, and no matter how the Russians are seeing it, this is how Western countries are seeing it. And this makes me wonder, what is the real message behind this repeated threat of nuclear war? And to me, this can only be stop helping the Ukrainians. And it hasn't worked at all. Now, why is this so significant and why are we talking about it? The Russians have a significantly different view of weapons of mass destruction than what Western nations have. Up until the 1980s, the Russian politicians and military commanders didn't even acknowledge that there was something like nuclear winter or consequences of exchange of nuclear weapons. To the Russians, nuclear weapons, and the same with particularly chemical weapons, they see this as just another weapon on the battlefield. NATO has very quickly during the Cold War realized that weapons of mass destruction, and in our case largely nuclear weapons, do not have any value on the actual battlefield. They are strategic weapons for a reason. They are strategic weapons, for example, the threat of using them on the person that or the country that is attacking us makes us deal with less on the battlefield than what we would have to deal with if we did not have that threat of nuclear weapons. Now, this is not, as I said, the Russian position. The Russian position is, this is a weapon like any other weapon, we can use it on the battlefield. And here's the problem with talking about it and actually using them. As I said, there is a chain of command, and for any kind of weapon to be useful on the battlefield, its use has to be delegated to the commander in the theater, which in essence means the general that is in that position, that he not only has the authority to authorize such an attack, it also has to be of value to him for the immediate battlefield situation. And that changes on one second to another. So what is the usefulness of such an ultimate weapon in conditions that can change right now while we are talking about it? They are completely useless, and I would hope that most of the Russian generals have that much intelligence left in their head that any kind of authority to use these weapons on the battlefield would be like, no, we are not. Now, the question about nuclear chain of command is particularly difficult because we Western countries, we view these as strategic weapons. And strategy and battlefield is a whole different ballgame. That is why authority to release nuclear weapons, for example, in the US, is ultimately with the president, not with any battlefield commander. The fact is also that the Russians know how we view nuclear weapons, and we know how the Russians view nuclear weapons, which makes this threat of using them so powerful, so effective, at least in Putin's view. Now, Putin's view is, if I threaten Western countries with strategic weapons, also on their own territory, not only in Ukraine, and I know they see them as strategic weapons, and I know that Western countries know I see these weapons as battlefield weapons to give me an advantage in the immediate fight, then the Western countries believe the threshold for nuclear weapons is much lower than it actually is. So, without going further into detail, Western response has basically been, you have been talking about this all day long, since you started the invasion. It hasn't stopped us sending weapons to Ukraine. It won't stop us sending weapons to Ukraine. And instead of threatening Putin back, well, we also have nukes. We're gonna glass the Kremlin before you get your rockets out of the ground. No. One of the responses, and I hate to say this has been a brilliant response by the British Parliament and in person of Boris Johnson. He is sending British armored vehicles, which means Challenger tanks and Warrior APCs, to Poland, so the Poles can send their T-72 tanks to Ukraine. And here is where this message starts to make sense of stop sending weapons to Ukraine. Because the situation in eastern Ukraine is going more and more in favor of the Ukrainians. First of all, looking at Mariupol. Last week, the Russians basically said, oh, we have taken Mariupol. Then they went down the scale of this back and said, we have Mariupol under siege. The last remaining Ukrainian forces are there. And what seems to be happening in reality is that videos and news have surfaced that those Ukrainian forces that are still in Mariupol are using weapons that Western countries have just recently sent and pledged to Ukraine. How is that possible if Mariupol is really under such a siege that the Ukrainians have no way out or no way in? It doesn't happen. It is absolutely impossible that Putin and the Russian forces have total control of eastern Ukraine. In fact, Mariupol has apparently not fallen, and Ukrainians are increasingly starting to use hit and run strategy in eastern Ukraine, denying the Russians any form of respite or initiative. In fact, the Ukrainians are starting to take the initiative. And this is where this threat makes any form of sense. Putin knows that the Western countries are starting to deliver weapons now, and it's only now becoming effective. Ukrainians starting to take the initiative, and Western support is beginning to arrive in Western Ukraine and starts to be effective. So what are the Ukrainians doing right now? They're keeping the Russians busy, they're hitting them where they don't expect it, and they are preparing for a counterattack. Now, in my last video about the sinking of the Moskva, I said my guess is that this attack will be in eastern Ukraine. It will not be on Crimea. And I would have increasing doubts that the attack will be to liberate Mariupol. Now, going back to the statements that have been made by British politicians and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, sending actual soldiers into Poland so the Poles can send more weapons to Ukraine faster. And knowing the Ukrainians have been doing a fantastic job, you can't say anything else. They have, with limited means, fought a war the Russians can't win. It's taken a tremendous toll on their people, and we can only imagine how brave these soldiers must be, knowing that their lives, their families, their country is being destroyed right in front of them, and not to give in, and slowly but steady starting to take the initiative away from the Russians. What we will see increasing hit and run tactics, and we will see Russian soldiers retreating, while Ukrainians are going to strike across the border. That is what Putin doesn't want. Putin doesn't want the Ukrainians actually move into Russian territory. That is what he doesn't want. He doesn't want them to take over Crimea again for various reasons. And that is increasingly the Western position. We not only want you out, that is the message the Western nations are sending. We are not only wanting you back to the lines before February, we want you back to where you were in 2008, long before this started. We don't want you in Crimea, we don't want you in the Donbass. And increasingly it looks like the Ukrainians are, with the limited support they have had so far, have not only stalled, but completely devastated Putin's plan, any plan that he may have had in Ukraine. And I jokingly said last week to a friend, well, I'm not surprised if the Ukrainians starting to go drive on Moscow. That is what Putin is afraid of. And once that threat becomes credible, that the Ukrainians are going to take the initiative, that the Ukrainians are not only threatening the Russians within their own border, but if they can strike across the border and get away with it, that is the moment when there will be a solution, and I doubt that will involve Putin. Thank you very much for your attention. Have a nice day. See you soon.